To say that the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy is beloved would probably be an understatement. These movies were an entire generation's first introduction to the character of Peter Parker and the mythos of Spider-Man as a whole, and in many ways are arguably responsible for superhero movies slowly becoming more and more recognized as the Hollywood blockbusters they are today, for better or for worse. To this day, the movies have a ridiculously passionate fan base that, in many ways, base their idea of what Spider-Man should be more off of these movies than the actual comic books the characters originate from. And even those who are less passionate about the trilogy struggle to deny that they are some of the best superhero movies ever made. Well, at least the first two are. Because of this, most of the modern discourse surrounding the first two movies paint the perception they have as being regarded as perfect. And while that definitely is quite true now, there was a time when this wasn't completely the case. That's not to say that Spider-Man 1 and 2 weren't widely positively received and praised when they came out, they most certainly were, but when the movies were slightly more recent, there were certain people, namely old internet critics, who had many different criticisms to levy against the movies, with Doug Walker going as far as to imply that the Amazing Spider-Man movies directed by Mark Webb were superior, at least in his eyes.
That has got to be the silliest image ever. Is he trying to act like he's just at the water cooler? Hey Spider-Man, yo, rap with me, brother.
That was really bad.
Now, of course, much of that old criticism has either been refuted or is just largely not talked about anymore, as the fan base for the Raimi movies only got stronger as the children who watched them grew up. There is, however, one piece of criticism that was talked about back then that is still brought up from time to time now when people discuss the first movie. One that, while understandable at a surface level, I've always held a certain amount of resentment towards. The criticism I'm speaking of is focused on the climax of the movie, where Spider-Man is helplessly trying to save both Mary Jane and a group of children while he is attacked by the Green Goblin. In this scene, Spider-Man is saved because the citizens of New York come to his defense, distracting the villain and allowing him to get the children and MJ out of harm's way. From as far back as I remember, the scene has always been criticized for being overly emotional and cheesy to the point of being ridiculous. Some have even gone as far as to imply that the scene was included as a response to the tragic September 11th attacks that had recently taken place.
How about that painfully forced scene with the New Yorkers standing triumphant against, well, a flying Green Goblin? It was after 9/11, folks. We really felt that spirit, even though it was a little corny. Sorry.
While it is possible that the scene may have ended up playing a bigger role than intended for that reason, I can't be entirely sure, I disagree with the idea that the scene was thrown into the movie as a simple feel-good scene. I would argue this scene, as cheesy and somewhat sappy as it is probably the most important scene within the entire final act. It is the emotional and thematic climax of the movie, and I believe that the ending of the movie would not work without it. So to prove my point, let's go through the movie so I can explain what led up to this moment and why I feel it is so important. While it does it in its own campy way, the beginning of the movie doesn't pull its punches about how Peter is treated. The movie opens with him getting laughed at as he desperately chases after the bus, and once he's finally allowed on, the mistreatment continues. The more we see of the school day, the more Peter is consistently picked on without doing anything to really provoke it. Aside from Harry and to an extent MJ, it practically feels like the whole school is against him. At the same time, we're introduced to Norman Osborn, and soon we see that, despite giving the outward appearance of a wealthy, confident businessman, he is dealing with his own problems. Despite already having created impressive new tech to show off, the board of directors and the visiting general seem unimpressed with his progress, and General Slocum, in particular, blatantly threatens to pull his funding if Norman doesn't achieve a successful human test with his new performance enhancers almost immediately, for seemingly no other reason than wanting an excuse to put Norman out of business in his own words. Soon after that, both Peter and Norman are shown gaining their respective powers, Peter's by accident and Norman's through a desperate attempt to save his company. The movie mainly focuses on Peter after this, but despite being out of the picture for a while, we soon see another comparison drawn between Peter and Norman. While both are confused and initially concerned about the strange things happening to them, Peter eventually attempts to use his powers for his own benefit, and both him and Norman make incredibly selfish decisions, with Peter letting an armed criminal escape purely to spite the manager who had screwed him over, and Norman sabotaging his competition's prototype and murdering the general who had threatened him. Obviously, what Norman did is far worse, don't get me wrong, but in the end, both made choices influenced by their ego and desire for revenge, rather than what was right. Neither men are rewarded for this, as Peter letting the criminal go led to the death of his uncle, and despite his crimes, Norman was still thrown out of his own company. This is where the similarities between them end, however. After apprehending the man he thought killed his uncle, Peter self-reflects and realizes it was his own bad decisions that led to Uncle Ben's death. He takes this lesson to heart and vows to honor his uncle and use his newfound powers selflessly rather than selfishly. Norman, meanwhile, merely doubles down. He confronts his new alternate personality, but in the end embraces it. He once again sets out for revenge, murdering the Oscorp board of directors, and for the first time comes into contact with Spider-Man, which is where the rivalry with the hero begins. Already we can see that while Norman and Peter are now opposed to each other, both at one time shared similar struggles to some extent. They were unfairly treated by those around them and then had newfound responsibility forced on them, with the only difference being Norman choosing to use himself as a test subject. Yet despite both of them having it pretty rough at the start of the movie, Peter chooses to rise above his wants and do what he thinks is right. You'd think that because he's deciding to be selfless, Peter would be rewarded for his efforts, but in reality, the hardship just keeps piling on. While he's not universally disliked, from the very beginning of his career as Spider-Man, Peter is forced to deal with hostility from the press trying to paint him as a criminal. And even some of the average citizens of the city seem to dislike him for no apparent reason. Combine that with Peter still facing many struggles in his personal life, it feels like despite trying to be the best person he can be, Peter is still getting the short end of the stick, and this comes to a head when he confronts the Green Goblin for the second time. These next two scenes were also commonly poked at for being overly silly and unintentionally funny, and
here's the real truth.
I'm not gonna say I don't understand why.
I like it, Kudji.
In the end, most of the jokes are just in good fun, at least these days. But still, it's a shame that so much focus is put on the undeniable silliness of this scene, and so little is put on what this scene is actually trying to show to the audience. It feels like a lot of people were so busy making fun of the Goblin's mannerisms and somewhat cliche dialogue that they miss the fact that this scene is where we really learn a lot about the Goblin as a character. You'd think that he'd be here to kill or deal with his nemesis, yet instead, he seems to see something in Spider-Man, perhaps already subconsciously noticing the similarities between them, and rather than kill the hero, he instead seeks to indoctrinate him. Norman suggests that despite the hero's efforts, in the end, the people of the city will reject him, want to watch him fail, hate him. He asks why Peter even bothers to care about people who clearly don't care about him, and all Peter can think to reply is simply that it's right. It's here that the Goblin truly explains his philosophy to both Peter and the audience.
There are 8 million people in this city, and those teeming masses exist for the sole purpose of lifting the few exceptional people onto their shoulders.
Norman has gone beyond just being apathetic to the struggles of those around him. He has convinced himself that everyday people of the world exist to serve the interests of people who he considers exceptional. In exact contrast to Peter's decision to try to use what he was given to do what was right, whether it benefits him or not, Norman seeks to justify his selfish behavior by saying due to his self-proclaimed superiority, it's his right to abuse and misuse others for his own goals. In the end, he leaves Spider-Man alive, telling him to consider his offer before taking flight. Of course, Norman's way of thinking is both self-centered and borderline psychopathic, but it's hard to deny that there is a grain of truth to what he tells Peter at the start of the conversation. Throughout the movie, we've seen just how cruel and uncaring average everyday people can be, the poor and rich alike. Even when Peter tries his hardest to be a selfless hero to the people of the city, he still isn't really appreciated, and this only gets worse after this talk. The Daily Bugle tries to paint Spider-Man as Green Goblin's accomplice, and the citizens eat the gossip up without a second thought, calling for Peter's arrest and beginning to reject him already. While morally we know that what Peter is doing is right, emotionally it's hard to not wonder what the point is in trying to help people when even those who have nothing but good intentions will face their vitriol. Looking at it from Peter's perspective, it might be difficult to not start thinking about things in the same pessimistic way as Norman. This leads to the latter half of the movie, where Peter continues to reject Norman's ideology, but aside from a few moments of minor sympathy being given to him, nothing has really changed. In the end, it all leads up to the events on the bridge. After discovering Spider-Man's identity, Norman kidnaps MJ and holds her hostage, forcing Spider-Man to choose between her and innocent children he is threatening. Peter attempts to reject the choice and save both of them, but of course he can't do it, not with the Green Goblin there to get in the way. In the end, it starts to seem helpless, like there's no way out for Peter, and without anyone to help him, he and the others are done for. The Goblin moves in to land the killing blow, and that's when it happens. At the last moment, Norman is robbed of his victory and his detestable outlook on the world is challenged. Spider-Man isn't saved by his powers, his wits, or even by one of his friends, but by people. Ordinary people. The same people who Norman insisted weren't worth saving. Maybe it's cheesy, maybe it's a little ridiculous, but I think this moment, this scene, is what makes the climax work. Norman doesn't just lose because Peter beats him up or because some other thing ruined his plans. He loses because his views are fundamentally proven wrong. Ordinary people aren't perfect. In many ways, they can be self-centered, easily manipulated, and even cruel. But when it really matters, when it's truly important, they will come together as a community to help each other. In the end, Peter was rewarded for his heroics, rewarded by having a crowd of people to defend him and help him save everyone, while Norman, the egocentric villain, is completely alone. Faced with this undeniable proof that he was wrong, Norman lashes out, dragging Peter off and brutalizing him. He whines about how Peter rejected him and then tries to claim that he'll make sure to make MJ's death slow and painful to hurt Peter even more. Peter rebounds, and in a moment of rage quickly defeats Norman, showing that the villain who thought so highly of himself was just as physically inferior to Peter as his selfish ideology was. In the end, he's left with only one option left. He begs. He reveals himself to Peter, but when Peter confronts him about everything he's done, he continues to deflect, trying to blame everything on his other personality. Norman was given one final chance to admit his mistakes, one final chance to take responsibility for his actions, and instead, he just continues to lie, trying to manipulate Peter's want for a father figure and take advantage of the opening he created. In the end, he dies pathetically, impaled on his own weapon after refusing to learn his lesson, pleading with Peter to not tell Harry what a shameful and pitiful excuse for a person he had been. I honestly believe this is one of the best climaxes in a superhero movie, and the reason for that is how emotional it is. It is a perfect moment of vindication for Peter and the perfect end for the detestable wretch that Norman Osborn had become. If you took that scene on the bridge out, though, or altered it to make Peter find another solution to the problem, I genuinely believe a lot of what makes it so good would disappear. Maybe I'm just a tad bit overly sentimental, but I honestly cannot imagine this movie ending another way, and as campy as it is, I think scenes like this are what truly make this movie special. I hope you all enjoy. I've been sitting on this idea for a while, but I finally got around to getting it done. I hope to make more videos like this in the future, so if you enjoyed it, I hope you'll look forward to what I do after this. I don't want to drag this out too much though, so I'll just leave things here for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time.